I'm a big fan of Jason Reitman, have been since he made Juno, but he's also made movies like Thank You for Smoking, Up in the Air and Young Adult, and most recently Tully, last year. And I've liked all of them to varying degrees, and I'm a fan of Hugh Jackman, so this looked pretty promising. Unfortunately, the movie doesn't really start off very strong. It's kinda boring actually. Well, first off, the movie is about the frontrunner of the 1988 US presidential election, Gary Hart, and if you know anything about the US presidency of that era, you know how that worked out, and it doesn't take long to figure out why. But yeah, the first part of the movie is just kinda boring, to be honest. They try to insert a lot of humor in it, but it just falls flat. Not that it's awful, it just doesn't land. It doesn't really work for some reason. It just comes across as very dry. And this is not an issue I've had with Reitman movies before. And overall nothing really clicks. I wasn't enjoying it very much at all. The whole movie also looks very boring. It has this grey-brown color palette. So not off to a good start. And about halfway through I was kinda getting worried. Or well, I'd pretty much lost all hope at that point. I wasn't expecting it to turn it around. But it did. It actually did. Because I then realized something. The movie is not about the election, or even about Gary Hart at all. It's actually about journalism, tabloids, politics in general, media, privacy, because this sort of marked the beginning of a new era, a shift in how journalism works. There's always been tabloids, but I think this was one of the first times legitimate newspapers really went after a politician and dug into their private life, instead of turning a blind eye. And it's sort of the beginning of the end of a right to privacy too. After this, the floodgates were opened, and anything was fair game. And people weren't sure if that was okay, and neither were the journalists. But 30 years later, we can pretty clearly see where that led us. And it brings up some interesting questions about ethics too. What's okay to put out there for everyone to see? And do we have a right to privacy? And should it matter what a politician or anyone does in their private life, if it's not illegal or hurting anyone? Does that reflect on their judgment and their policies? And is it relevant? And if it is, should it overshadow everything else they've done? It also touches on things like outrage culture and public shaming. People these days jump to conclusions and are very quick to shame someone publicly in front of millions of people before the facts are in. And is that okay? So this movie is actually surprisingly relevant today. It brings up some good points. And it ended up being a very different movie from what I expected. And there's a lot of substance in there too, especially in the second half. It's also kinda interesting to think of the ramifications of this whole thing. Had things turned out differently for Gary Hart, and they easily could've, the consequences on a global and historical scale could be massive. We might be living in a very different world right now. And that's not an exaggeration. All you have to do is look at what happened in the next few years, and the chain of events that got triggered, and led to where we are as a world right now. Oh, and on a less serious note, Bill Burr also shows up in this. He's a journalist, and he's one of the few genuinely funny parts in this. Now, granted, I'm highly biased, because I'm a huge fan of his stand-up and his podcast. But the contrast between him and the rest of the humor in this is pretty stark, and just highlighted the fact that the rest of it wasn't that funny. But it was eye-opening and turned out to be really interesting actually. It got the old brain cells firing, and got me thinking how delicate history is. How small stuff that's kinda trivial in the grand scheme of things can have immeasurable consequences, even decades later. I don't know, but I ended up liking this movie quite a bit. Or maybe actually appreciating it. Because as a piece of entertainment, as a self-contained drama, it wasn't that compelling. But it was fascinating, as far as the questions it raised and the points it made goes. But would I recommend it? Probably, but not if you just want to be entertained. There are better movies for switching off your brain and having a good time. So maybe check it out. Maybe don't. I'm not your dad. But I am trying to sell out, so consider liking, subbing, hitting that bell and supporting me on Patreon. Because I really need that custom painted campaign bus. And hey, why not drop a comment below or check out another review? I'd really appreciate it. Thanks.